commodities. We're going to be talking about what they're telling us, which direction prices are heading. We're going to be referencing palladium, iron ore, copper, lumber. We're going to start out by looking at these commodities through the lens of vehicle sales, motor vehicle assemblies. And to do that, we're going to have Jeff Snider explain the difference between motor vehicle assemblies and who reports that and who reports light vehicle sales and the difference. And Jeff was just telling me how there's different organizations. And then there's a private organization, Autodata, that also reported recently. So Jeff, let's talk about the United States. Jeff Snider, head of global research at Alhambra Investments. Let's talk about what the September data told us.
Well, as far as auto sales go, they were just horrible, atrocious across the board. And it really didn't matter which data provider or estimator put out the numbers because they were bad either way. Now, Autodata, as you just said, Emil, they're the private company. Obviously, they're the ones that are involved in specifically the automobile sector. And they thought that on a seasonally adjusted annual rate, auto sales in September were less than 10 million, which is coronavirus bad. This is, 2009 bad. And the BEA, which just produced their own estimates of vehicle sales in light vehicle sales in September, weren't nearly as bad. They thought it was around 13 million rather than less than 10 million. But either way, 13 million is also a pretty bad number. That's a really, really low number. And it's indicative of auto sales that are absolutely collapsing and not in any way good numbers, especially if you're in the auto business, but raising more questions about what must be going on in more than just, what's going on with these auto sales.
I'm showing a couple of graphs from your article. The article was posted on the 4th of October, 2021, and the title was, What's the Real Downside to Some of These Key Commodities? And of course, you can find that at Alhambra Investments, and you show us a zoomed in version of this assemblies and sales since 2016, and then a little bit longer view from 2005 to give us some real context about how low, to your point of like, wow, this is 2009, 2020 recession shock level. Well, we're not in a recessionary shock right now. What we are experiencing, perhaps then what can explain this, is the logistical snafus that you've been writing about in many of your articles. Ladies and gentlemen, if you want to learn about supply chains, logistics, new orders, we're not going to go over it in this show unless you want to bring it up, Jeff, or in this whole episode. But you've been writing about small e economic inventory cycles a lot in the last week. So people, if you want to check that out, go ahead and go to Alhambra Investments. Jeff, you're saying that one possible explanation for this is the COVID-related shutdowns that, if I understand correctly, the Chinese, they have a zero tolerance policy. So if anyone's got it anywhere on the port, they shut down the whole thing. Seems like a crazy overreaction now, 18, 20 months into this pandemic. But that's what's leading to these low levels of vehicle sales, plus the chip shortage. We went over it in a previous episode where I learned that one of the key factories that manufactures microchips for the vehicle industry had a fire in March, and only in June or July did they get back fully online. Same thing, there was disorder in Malaysia where they had to lock down. Apparently Malaysia is a key fabrication hub for these microchips. So lots of things are getting in the way. Maybe it's not a bad economy. Maybe it's just the logistical snafus.
Yeah, and that's certainly the case. There is definitely a microchip shortage. In fact, I believe that, you've seen internet stories of, partially made or nearly fully assembled vehicles that are just waiting microchips to be finished. And that is definitely part of the problem here is that, look, we can't source enough microchips. There are other component shortages around the world as well. There's all sorts of problems then trying to, once you order them, how long does it take to get them? Supplier lead times are through the roof. That is definitely happening. And when you look at auto sales, the fact that sales have been so much higher than the ability of producers to keep up with those sales has meant that inventories at not just the dealer level, but also wholesale level are at historic lows. So they're not only, there's not a lot of product coming off of finished product coming off the assembly lines. There's not a lot of spare inventory either. And it stands to reason that, given those facts, that auto sales would tank. Auto sales would go much lower because there's just not a lot of cars to be able to sell. But is that the only thing that's going on here? Is that really the only issue? Is it just supply bottlenecks? Is it just semiconductor chips and things like that? Because, whether it's 10 million or 13 million in September, that's an awfully low number. That's a really suspiciously low number that, yes, inventories are down, but are they down that bad? Are they really that bad where we can't sell that many cars? I think that's the big part of what's going on in sales, is that they're being held back by lack of supply. But is that really the only thing going on here?
This reminds me of the Federal Reserve's reverse repo program, right? Because there is a mainstream narrative that does explain why why the reverse repo program is surging in value. But you also, in that example, said, but is that the only reason that we're seeing a surge over there? In that case, you say, you know what? It coincided, the movement, the fluctuations, the inflections in this program occurred on key collateral important days that something went wrong in the monetary system. So maybe there's also a collateral shortage or need in the system that suggests something's wrong with the monetary order. And same thing here. Let's not give the mainstream narrative, we give it credence, but full credence where it explains everything. You give three
Yeah, it
reasons.
doesn't exclude all other possibilities. I think that's really what we're saying here, is that, look, okay, yes, there's a chip shortage, there's problems in production, but let's not stop there. Let's not just accept that this is some benign excuse that explains everything.
You give three reasons why there might be trouble as well. First, no more helicopters. You'll tell us what that means. Second, a lot less unemployment payment. Blah. Second, a lot less unemployment payments. And last, most of all, none of these things appear to have generated anything like a full recovery. Stimulus, not really stimulating. Tell us.
Yeah, well, the helicopter obviously refers to Uncle Sam's generous donations to taxpayer bank accounts earlier this year, which is now October, which means those helicopter payments are more than half a year in the rearview mirror. And while economists, especially neo-Keynesian economists, presume that such stimulus has lasting impacts in the real economy, recent history, as well as going back to 2008, shows that that's not really the case, especially in an overall deflationary environment. That helicopter stimulus might have short-run, even very, very, very large short-run impacts, but never more than short-run effects, which means that having been more than 6 months away from the last of those, we might instead expect that those positive contributions to immediate spending activity are really starting to fade. And one of the areas where there was very clear correlation between particularly auto sales and the auto business and Uncle Sam's generosity was autos. So if there's less money from Uncle Sam floating through the economy, maybe that's part of the reason that sales have come down too, in addition to lack of supply. And of course, now we have what's called the unemployment cliff or the benefits cliff, where a lot of the pandemic type relief programs are being eliminated because politicians are following what central bankers and economists are telling them. And their economists and central bankers are telling them that their previous stimulus packages were so successful, they're in danger of becoming too successful. So no reason to continue these pandemic relief programs because the economy is just so good and the labor market is moving so quickly that there's no reason to continue them. But yet, if that's not the case, if the economy hasn't been stimulated, then you remove Uncle Sam's helicopter as well as the benefits, the pandemic benefits. What's left is maybe the same economy that we went into this with, which may be not so good. And so we're talking about not just supply constraints, but also maybe there's a touch of demand questions going on here too.
An illustration by David Parkins that goes to your point. What does it show? The SS econometric ship heading straight for the unit route iceberg. And somebody calls out, probably someone who's not an economist, iceberg. No, that's not in the model. So the point being, the stimulus payments and spending, I guess it worked during moments when the economy was just in a recession, right? A lull from 1945 all the way until 2007. It doesn't work when we're in some sort of a shock that we can't escape out of for 14 years. Some people call that a depression. And I'm going to pull up a graph, Jeff, the most important graph in macro, in my opinion, that captures this perfectly, which you included in your essay here, your blog post. And this is the key. This is the key. The official unemployment rate suggests that stimulus will work. Wow, we're almost back to those lows that we saw in the late 90s and the mid 2000s. Great job, economists and politicians. We're almost back there. But then you show the civilian unemployment ratio, civilian employment population ratio, and it is appalling.
Nowhere near.
Appalling.
It's awful.
A disaster. And so maybe you're saying, right? Maybe auto sales are so poor in September because of the chip shortages, and maybe also because we're not getting that free money and the employment.
What's the flip side of that argument? The flip side of that argument is maybe auto sales were so good earlier in this year, not because the economy was recovering, but because it was boosted artificially by all that federal government cash. That's a very different situation. It's certainly not the situation that was supposed to happen. The way you described it, Emil, was supposed to be what was going to go on, right? The government boosts aggregate demand, and that leads to pump priming and then all sorts of positive impacts, a greater than one multiplier, as economists like to say, from that point forward. So all you got to do is spend the money, that gets everything moving, and then it's hunky-dory from there on out. What we're saying is that no, maybe auto sales in particular, but not just auto sales, maybe a lot of other things too, were artificially boosted. And that's the only reason they were boosted, was because of the artificial reasons. The economy didn't actually recover. It was just sort of manipulated into looking like it was recovered, because that's what economists think they must do. Even though, I guess, as I say, fiscal stimulus doesn't ever seem to work. Japan is a perfect example of this. No matter how big and how large, or through what channel they stuff it into, it doesn't come out the other side. It has short-run impacts, but never more than short-run impacts. So is it really outlandish to begin thinking that now in October of 2021, again, more than half a year since those big stimulus programs, that we might be seeing the downside of them? The artificiality gets squeezed out. It dissipates from the global economy, the U.S. economy in particular, the goods economy in particular, and now we're going back to sort of reverting to the mean, where the mean isn't a healthy economy; it's the same sick economy that we started out with.
We're going to talk about some commodities now, but that very last point you made there is an important one. The goods sector seems to be doing much better than much of the rest of the economy. And tell me if I have this right, Jeff. It's because we couldn't go outside. We couldn't go to theaters. We couldn't do anything like that. We couldn't enjoy services, restaurants. So we were at home and we were ordering things. Goods.
Yeah, rather than going out and drinking or eating and whatever else people do to have fun, they were sitting in front of their computer and ordering goods from Amazon. And why not? I mean, they had $1,400 or better from the government. And so they spent a lot of money on, especially durable goods. Some people would put down payments on cars and thought, why not? What else have I got to do, because I can't go anywhere else? And so services spending, not only did it contract and collapse tremendously in 2020, it never really came back. And to this day, it is still less than services spending in the U.S. economy is less than it was in February of 2020. And that's up through September data, or August data, excuse me. So Americans went nuts buying durable goods, partly because they couldn't spend money on services, partly because they were given a free handouts from the federal government. And why anybody would think that this would be a lasting overall, not only just to have lasting impact, but become our new economic baseline moving forward, it just boggles my mind. I mean, what we're talking about here, Emil, is really common sense. The government pushed a bunch of cash into the economy. It went through the economy. It created all this artificial demand, this artificial activity. Now there's no more cash from the government. The economy just goes back to where it was, because that's how economies work. You can't just create economic growth from nothing. And it certainly doesn't help if the government gets involved, because it is the most wasteful, inefficient engine possible. So what we're seeing, or what I am alleging that we're seeing, and I think you agree with me, what we're starting to see, what we're seeing more and more, is the fact that yeah, there was a lot of stuff earlier in the year, but it was never going to last. It was transitory. It was always going to be transitory, and it was predictably transitory. And what that meant was once we got to the other side of the transitory, it was going to look more ugly than anybody had been prepared for.
Now, you bring up a few examples from commodity markets that corroborate your point. The first one is palladium, which is the black sheep of the precious metals family. If you can imagine a table where you've got king gold and queen silver and then prince platinum, and then walks in palladium, which is named after Athena, by the way, Pallas Athena. Imagine her decked out in goth gear, black nails, black lipstick, dyed black hair, sullen teenager, doesn't want to have anything to do with the family. Why? Because it has like no investment demand, very little ornamental demand. It all goes towards industrial uses. Specifically, the biggest sector, 80% of it, goes to catalytic converters for gasoline-powered engines to clean the exhausts. And I'm going to pull up a graph. Guess what? Palladium prices are down very heavily. Jeff, I was reading a report, and the metals analyst was explaining why this is the case, and they gave several reasons. 3, if going off memory. 1, the chip shortage, production halts, vehicle sales being down so much relative to last year. Number 2, the rising dollar. And number 3, rising yields on U.S. treasuries. But as this graph I'm going to pull up, Jeff, shows, the timing on those last 2 items doesn't quite work out as to when the dollar started to rise earnestly and when treasury yields started to rise earnestly. When did palladium prices peak?
As we see with a lot of things back in May, early May. So we have the April-May transition. And you're right. I think a lot of people are looking at palladium because it's basically catalytic converters or nothing. It's the auto business, right? And so what we're seeing with palladium prices allegedly is what these problems in the auto business. And the palladium market, therefore, is saying the chip shortage, the supply constraints, they're going to constrain automobile production for much, much, much longer than maybe people are anticipating. And that's the reason why palladium's down so much, is that, well, it's, it's the supply problems. The supply bottlenecks in the economy are going to be around with us for a very long time. So even though it's a lower commodity price, it sounds like it's going along with the inflation story. The supply problems are going to boost the prices across the board, just not this one particular commodity, which is susceptible to production of automobiles.
Our next item, our next commodity, iron ore. Same story, we are told, right? Stainless steel production down somewhat for the second half of the year. And where's steel used in? It's mainly consumer durables, believe it or not. So we can see again how there's a relationship of goods ordering for stainless steel. Perhaps the stimulus spending on infrastructure in China has lapsed now that we're in the second half of the year. And what do we see? Why would these 2 metals be peaking at the exact same time? Because that's exactly what happened almost to the day, Jeff.
And it's, and not just what you said with China. Don't forget also the pollution control emphasis, which is a renewed policy by the Chinese government, which says we're going to cut back on electricity usage and generation, as well as industrial capacity. So, here we go again, where there's some other excuse other than maybe weak macro demand, which says, oh, palladium, that's automobiles. Oh, iron ore, well, that's Chinese pollution controls. Yet here we have 2 somewhat related but relatively different commodities, very much industrial based. Yet here they are, they peak at, as you said, almost exactly the same time. And then they're significantly lower ever since. Whereas both of them, the bulk of that declined since the middle of July. And so, okay, now we're starting to think, okay, maybe it can't just be automobiles. It can't just be Chinese pollution control, because we're seeing this pattern in somewhat related, but kind of different commodities. And where else do we see the same thing? And the next one is copper. And so now we're not talking about automobiles and catalytic converters at all. And we're not really talking about consumer durables. We're talking about something completely different with copper. And copper is more generally macro exposed anyway, is heavily influenced by Chinese factors. But yet it's not down as much as palladium or lumber or iron ore. which tells us that, okay, maybe those are the reasons why those are down as much as they are. But the fact that copper peaked again in May and then has lower ever since, which is now we're stretching out a period of 5 months, again, can't be randomness. And it can't just be autos. It can't just be Chinese pollution control. It can't be electricity rationing. There has to be some unifying factor behind all of these industrial-based commodities that are now starting to, after a rapid rise up to May, they're starting to at least level off and move lower, if not substantially lower.
There's one more, Jeff, that seems completely unrelated, and it's lumber, almost to the day, also peaking. I have a little quote here from Mike Green that I'm going to read because I just saw an interview with him and Matt Stoller. And Matt Stoller is the author of Goliath, and I think he's the leading voice on monopolies in the United States and around the world, and the negative effect they have on the economy. And they were discussing what the state of the monopoly is and what's the government going to do about it. Not much, apparently. And here's a quote where they did talk about lumber, and apparently has to do a little bit with the whole topic of monopolies. Here's Mike Green. An optimized system can certainly lower costs, but it is also much more fragile. We saw this with lumber last year, where the mill operators chose to reduce production in the face of pandemic. They chose to scale back. We didn't see a shortage of timber. It's not like trees disappeared. We actually had a significant reduction in capacity for a relatively brief window of time, because apparently there's only, it's only coming from a few mills that are controlled by more monopolistic ownership. Jeff, you go on.
Emil, that was widespread throughout, not intentionally, but the similar types of circumstances where supply of copper, for example, copper mines that got shut down during the pandemic, they weren't easily brought back online. And you can't just flip a switch and make up for lost time. You can't just, we're going to dig extra out of the ground today that we didn't dig out yesterday. It's very difficult to do that. So a lot of these inflation darlings like lumber and copper that people couldn't talk enough about earlier in the year, yet they're tracing out these same patterns, which must be for very different reasons. And a lot of it had to do with, this talk of a commodity super cycle, this talk of commodity-based inflation was predicated on, we're not going to pay any attention to the demand side of the equation because that's going to be awesome. All the government stimulus, all the government money, not just the United States, but all the rest of the world, demand was going to go through the roof and stay through the roof forever. That's what everybody presumed, or that's what it was assumed, that we wouldn't have to worry about demand. Everything was all focused on supply. And so long as supply was constrained, prices would go up forever, if not into the stratosphere. And some of them actually reached that far, like palladium. Now we're starting to see since May, in fact, that it's this uniform change or inflection in all these commodity prices, except oil. That's a different commodity altogether. And we'll get to that. I think we'll get to that in a future episode. But we see these industrial commodities, May, they peak, and now they're going in a different direction because maybe there is question about demand. Maybe the demand isn't so solid and isn't going to perform in exactly the way that everybody presumed. Government stimulus doesn't have lasting impacts. And so while there are still supply problems in these various commodities, copper in particular, that, even as some of the supply problem lingers forward, there's greater questions about demand now these prices are adjusting to regardless of the supply situation. And that's really the consistent pattern we're seeing, not just in commodities, but as we've been talking about ever since this happened, even going back further, the rising dollar, global bond yields, Fedwire, all that stuff. We've been warned that this was the inevitable conclusion here, that government stimulus was creating artificial but temporary effects in the real economy and in real markets, but those were going to wane over time. And when they did, you were going to see that the end result was not recovery, but was very likely going to be somewhat substantially less than recovery, which is what we're really talking about here. Questions about demand, which means that we're really questioning whether or not we were in a recovery this entire time.
Let me share a few more graphs, Jeff. This comes from the World Bank, the pink sheets, which you reference often enough. And they break down the commodities along several different categories. The one that we've been discussing is the metals and minerals composite one. And we can see exactly what you're saying, a peak, and has since then, this is year over year as well as the 6 month moving average, we can see how it's coming off the boil, as the British like to say. That's metals and minerals. Precious metals. Why do you need precious metals for safe haven protection when we're entering a world of recovery, when the worst is behind us? So apparently that's what the market participants believe. When you look at agriculture, though, same thing. It's still somewhat elevated, quite high, but it's also been peaking, and now it's in our rearview mirror. The one that hasn't, to your point, is oil, energy,
crude oil, absolutely,
and natural gas. We've got crude oil and natural gas in here, which is, from my understanding,
if you're in Europe, it's going to be a huge problem.
Yeah, well, it's due to what Russia's doing. Plus, they had earthquakes. We talked about this as well, how natural gas is rising for many, many reasons that have nothing to do with printing by central banks or spending by the government.
But this is also normal too. I mean, and that's kind of the point of the other article I wrote, which is that crude oil and energy prices overall are lagging indicators. So we have observed, and we expect that there will be these periods where industrial and base commodity prices go lower, starting to signal something different, while energy prices continue to go through the roof. That was the case in 2018 in particular, where you had metals and mineral prices peak in January as the dollar started to turn higher, as we just talked about in the previous episode, while crude and energy prices continued to rise and rise and rise, which is the only thing people paid attention to in 2018. So they thought, oh, the commodity markets are signaling inflation, when in fact the commodity markets had already turned against inflation from the very start of 2018. So what we're saying now is that, yes, we're kind of seeing the same rollover pattern in a wide variety of industrial-based metals. It can't be for just automobiles. It can't just be for Chinese electricity policy. It can't be for the number of sawmills that are available. There has to be some unifying factor behind all these commodities. And it's starting to look in much the same way as we've seen all these other reflationary inflection points throughout the last 10, 12 years, whatever it's been. And that's questions about demand. Demand is never, it doesn't turn out to be what it's supposed to be, because number one, stimulus never stimulates. And then one of the reasons stimulus never stimulates is number two, we're not out of the same Eurodollar broken monetary problem paradigm, whatever you want to call it, that's been plaguing the global economy ever since August 2007. And so balance of probabilities from the very start of this thing in 2020, we were never going to see that was such a low probability event. And that's really why bond yields have never gotten very high. They've never gotten very far, because what we're saying here is that outside of temporary impacts, transitory impacts from government spending and direct deposit injections into depositors' accounts, that was all it was ever going to be, nothing more than transitory. And now we're starting to see these very important leading indicators and these very important leading commodity markets, as well as other markets, start to agree that, yes, that's the situation. Demand is by far the biggest question mark going forward.
Is the world going back to the 1970s? That's the question that The Economist recently asked in an article. And I'm going to read parts of that article to Jeff and get his reaction, as well as maybe, if we're lucky, talk about something called the Volcker myth.